Hello. Well, before I was lauded with all these laurels that they were kind enough to bestow on me, I was a working man, a sailor before the mast, and ranked myself among the numbers of the unemployed. And it's that proletarian side of my life to which I cling and will to the day I die. So if I'm going to stand here and yap for a while, we better have some darn good reasons, don't you think? I'll give you three. First, I'll talk about how I became a writer, just in case any of you harbor such artistic ambitions. You'll either be inspired or dissuaded, but you know what it took. And then I'll tell you about how I became a socialist, so that by the end of our talk, you'll know what a socialist was. And read our books and fight with us or fight against us. Yes? Fair enough? Fair enough. And lastly, I'll talk about my long acquaintance with John Barleycorn. Any of you know John? Booze, hooch, whiskey. So that at the end of our talk, you'll vote with me for women's suffrage. Because if women get the vote, they'll put the final nails in the coffin of John Barleycorn. Because the mothers, the wives, the daughters that pay the price that John Barleycorn extols on their men. And one day we can all look back on this pseudo-civilization in which we now live, in which the sale of soul poison is licensed on every street corner. You with me? All right. Well, we might as well start at the beginning. I was born in San Francisco in 1876, the centennial year of these United States, and California was just a quarter century old. And the stories of the 49ers and the gold rush still filled the air. And you might say gold was in our veins. We were longing for the next big strike. But we left San Francisco when I was 2 to escape a diphtheria epidemic. You see, my father, as I know and love him, John London, he was a Civil War veteran with one bad lung, a widower with a whole passel of children who had to leave most of them behind and came out with 2, including his youngest. This is why he came out to California. His youngest had consumption, and the doctors told him to go out to the dry climate of the West. So he came to San Francisco. And unfortunately, his son passed, but he would take me on as his son and give me his love the rest of my life. So we moved over to Oakland and ran a grocery store, grew groceries and sold them. And then my mother was, Flora Wellman, was a very ambitious, driven woman, never happy in one place. So just when we'd be putting down roots, let's go somewhere better, bigger. So we moved from farm to farm then, around the Livermore Valley and Alameda County. And in fact, that's where I got my first introduction to John Barleycorn. See, I had to work at the age of 5. Bringing out lunch to my father in the field was one of my chores, along with a pail of beer. Now, the adults wouldn't let us kids have it, so I knew it must be precious stuff, right? So on the way out to the field, one day I decided to wrap my diminutive frame around the bucket of beer and sip from the foam. Ugh. Whatever was precious in the stuff did not reside in the foam, I determined. So I stuck my face down and sucked from the solid liquid below. It was terrible. But I thought it must be like castor oil, it tastes bad, but it's good for you. So I sipped a few times on the way back out. And by the time I got to my father, I had to stir the foam up to the brim to make it look full. And he drank down his beer to slake the thirst of a dusty plowman without noticing a thing. And all was well until Boom! Down I went, right in front of the plowshare. He almost cut me in half. And at the age of 5, John Barleycorn, alcohol, almost got me. So, well, my next bout was when I was 7. Went over to a wedding at a nearby farm, Italian family. Now, my mother, she had filled my young head with ideas about the dark-eyed races and that they'd stab you in the back. So there I was, sitting, minding my own business when this dark-eyed Italian boy come looking at me, and he must have been 11 or so, and he pours a glass of wine, pushes it over to me. Drink it. So I was terrified. I drank it. All the way down. Filled it again. Drink. On I went. Again. I drained the whole carafe. Now there was a crowd watching the prodigy child. I was so petrified that no circulation must have been getting to my stomach, so the alcohol could get to my brain. So I passed that test, and again. Oh, I walked my way home, and boom, down I fell in a ditch. And again, I just barely escaped the clutches of John Barleycorn. I could have drowned in the bottom of that ditch. Now, you ever hear the saying, work hard and you'll get ahead? Right? The American dream, right? Well, I was indoctrinated with that. Work hard and you'll get ahead. So even while I was still in school, elementary school, I had to work. So I'd get up at 4 in the morning to deliver morning papers, then go straight to school, and then after school, the evening papers. On Saturdays, I'd deliver ice on the ice wagon, and Sundays, I'd set up bowling pins for drunken Dutchmen. And every penny went where? To my mother. That's right. Work hard to get ahead. So I started working hard then. Now, by the time I was 10, we moved back to Oakland. And there I had the discovery of the treasure trove of a sultan, or so it seemed to me. It was the Oakland Public Library. And I had only had my 4 wonder books till then. I read them over and over and devoured them. My favorite was Ouida's Cygna. But I never knew the end of that story until years later, because my volume was missing the last 20 pages or so. But it was about a poor boy who worked hard, became a famous musician. So that work hard and get ahead was planted in me. But now I took whole shelves of books in alphabetical order and just started reading through. And I would have gone on this way to the librarian, Ina Colbreth. She took me under her wing and guided my reading. So I owe a lot to librarians. She later became the first poet laureate of San Francisco. So now, I'm reading and I'm working. But soon I finished grammar school and it was time for me to go to work full time. How old are you, young man? 9? You going to work yet? No? 100 years ago, likely you would have. On the farm or in the factory. And here you start to get a glimmer of what socialists were up to. One of the main things we were trying to do was end child labor so that children could have a childhood and parents could have a good paying job, not be competing with their own kin. Sound fair enough? Well, we thought so. So now, I got a job at Hickmott's Cannery. And I would stay at that machine, working at a machine over and over. 14 years old, working in a sweatshop. How much suppose I was paid an hour? 10 cents an hour. working hard to get ahead. Now, even at that age, I wrote down on a pad of paper, calculated how long it would take me to become a millionaire at 10 cents an hour. I'd have to live to be Methuselah. So I decided, the only way out I could see was to be a criminal, a pirate on the San Francisco Bay, an oyster pirate. I heard the tales of the oyster pirates whenever I went down to the waterfront wharf, whenever I had a free moment, borrowed a little skiff, sailed around, I'd hear these were young men who took life into their own hands and stole those oysters from the company-controlled beds around the bay and sold them for a handsome profit on the docks. Well, to be an oyster pirate, you had to have a boat. I had to become a capitalist. But where was I? 15, now gonna get $300 for a boat I saw for sale. Well, I went to my mammy, Jenny, at whose black breast I had suckled as a babe. You see, my mother couldn't nurse me, and he knew that Jenny Prentice had lost her baby, and so for the first 2 years of my life, I lived more with her than with my family, and she was like a mother to me. I kept in touch, and I went, found this hard-working woman, and 15, with nothing to show I could ever pay her back, I asked her for $300, which must have been about her life savings she had stowed away. And first she said, "Johnny, you can't, you'll get thrown in jail." And I said, "In jail I'll get 3 meals a day and a bed, better than living and dying in the sweatshops." And she said, "Whatever I have is yours." She handed it to me. I never forgot her for it. I put her up in a house with her husband when they hit on evil times for the rest of my life. Later, but it was a long wait. But I took that money and went down to the Oakland Wharf and found a grizzled old sea dog named French Frank who wanted to sell his sloop, the Razzle Dazzle. And we exchanged the money and they broke out. The John Barleycorn, always waiting. Now, you see, I soon found that the way of the wharf and the waterfront is the way of John Barleycorn. You want to work on the Barbary Coast? You got to drink with the men. Deals are done in the saloons. Men are hired in the saloon, paid off in the saloon. So, still, it was bad wine. Whenever no one was looking, I threw it overboard. But I now made up to $150 a day. It'd take me months in the sweatshop. And not every penny this time went to my family, but most of it did. But I soon learned to outdrink, outfight, outsail, and outsteal the old sea dogs, and I was dubbed Prince of the Oyster Pirates. And they were soon behind my back, were taking bets on how long I would live. Yeah? And they weren't wrong, because at 16, I found myself floating one morning about 4 a.m. in San Francisco Bay without any idea how I had gotten out there. I had been on a 2-week drunken debauch. And that's when John Barleycorn played his diabolical trick on me. I heard a voice in my ear. Go out with the tide. Drift out through the Golden Gate. It's a manly way to die. And here at 16, never having seen more than a pin's prick of the glorious surface of the globe, never having sailed in the joy fields of philosophy and art, I thought I had done it all. Seen all that was worth seeing. And I could see what lay ahead for me by looking at those old wharf rats, drunk in the gutter, prison stripes, or pauper's grave. So I began to sing my death dirge and cry bitter tears for my lost youth. And only surviving due to the antifreeze in my system. Somewhere around dawn, I began to swallow seawater. And suddenly, I could think of many good reasons to live, but it looked unlikely that I would. And then a Greek fisherman heading in for Vallejo scooped me up. Like a salmon, I flopped on his deck, and once again, I barely escaped John Barleycorn's clutches. Huh? Yeah? If you dance with the devil, somebody's got to pay the piper. So, I decided I'm going to die on the Barbary Coast. I got to get a law-abiding life, become an upstanding citizen. So, I went from being an oyster pirate to a deputy fish patrolman, getting paid on commission for hauling in my old buddies, the oyster pirates. And they were a rough crowd. And Scratch Nelson, who got his name because he'd rip a man's face off in a fight. Well, now I found that everybody on the waterfront wanted to put a shiv in my back. And I learned a lesson that I learned often in life. The man behind the badge is often worse than the man behind the bars. And those fish patrolmen outdrank, outfought, and outstole the oyster pirates. Well, after many hardy adventures, I decided to get away from the Barbary Coast altogether if I was going to survive out of my teens. And so, at 17, I signed aboard the Sophia Sutherland, a sealing schooner headed for the Bering Sea via Hawaii and the Bonin Islands. And I finally bid farewell to the Golden Gate after only traveling in my books. And now all my mates and I had such dreams. We were going to find islands that no white man had ever seen and discover tribes that no white man had ever known. And at every port of call, guess where we ended up? The Wharfside Saloon, the ever-present one. Just another way that John Barleycorn, alcohol, robs life from you. But still, I had great adventures. Now, while I was sailing, that was the first time I had the idea. I was reading every piece of literature on the ship over and over again. And I thought, hey, I could write better stories than this. I've already lived better stories than this. So that planted an idea in my head. But I had a long journey of 7 months before I'd be back home. And so I had to stand up to those sailors because they had resent for me because I was signed on as an able-bodied seaman without ever having been in deep water, and they had come up as cabin boys and all the like such. And so there was a great hulking French sailor. And one day when it was his chance to his turn to clean the molasses tub, as I was sitting there studiously reading, he says, "Boy, go clean the molasses tub. You're always eating it." I said, without looking up, now I could feel every sailor aboard has his eyes on me. And if I did what that sailor said, I'd be fetching and carrying for everybody on board for the rest of the voyage. So I just said, "Fill it yourself. I never touched the tar." And he came at me. And he was bigger, but I was quicker. And I jumped on his back, and I throttled his neck. And he began leaping up and banging my head against the beams, and blood was pouring down my face, but he couldn't see it. So I held on. I said, "Let me alone now." And he, "Hey, boy, I let you alone." And he did. And so did every sailor aboard. Well, when I got back, I decided now, well, I spent literally 70 cents on drinks for my old buddies, the Oyster Pirate, at Johnny Heinhold's First and Last Chance Saloon in Oakland. Anybody know it? Anybody been there? There you go. It's like made out of a little old boat. It's a little snug little, barely walk into it, yeah. But Johnny Heinhold, there was a man I turned to over and over, years after I had spent money at his bar for a loan, yeah. Because I found that it's the working people or the really poor that are the last hope of a hobo or a man in need. When the house on the hill turns you away, you go to the shack across the tracks and they'll give you half their dinner. So, I then took the rest of my pay and it went to, where? My mother. And now I had to get another job. Hey, well, I worked in a jute mill. And now we're making rope for the ships, yeah. And I was, now, I was a strapping young man. Had been a sailor before the mast, seen the world. How much suppose now I was paid an hour? 10 cents an hour. Work hard and you'll get ahead, right? Well, on I went, working hard to get ahead, and I knew this wasn't going to work. So I thought, maybe my mother is the one who got the idea. She saw an ad in the San Francisco Call for a young writer contest. And so I was exhausted from the work, and yet I forced myself to sit down and write out 2,000 words one night, 2,000 words the next. The limit was 2,000 words. So the last night before I had to send it in, I had to cut it down in half again. Aye. And then struggle my way through work. And do you know, I won that $25. And you know who came in second and third? Students from Berkeley and Stanford. Well, you know, would you like to hear just a little bit of that first story of mine ever get published? Now, a lot of young writers ask me, how do you become a writer? And, well, I tell them, you got to live. First, you know, you have to get out and live life so you have some philosophy of life, so you have some experience of life. Yeah? Yeah. And so I think that's probably why I won, because I had just experienced this. I wasn't making it up like those college boys. Typhoon off the coast of Japan. Well, I'll just tell you that I started off saying that there was a very sick sailor when I was keeping company with below decks when this storm hit. We had the first watch from 8 to midnight. The wind was soon blowing half a gale, and our sailing master expected little sleep that night as he paced up and down the poop. The topsails were soon clewed up and made fast. Then the flying jib run down and furled. Quite a sea was rolling by this time, occasionally breaking over the decks, flooding them and threatening to smash the boats. At 6 bells, we were ordered to turn them over and put on storm lashings. This occupied us till 8 bells, when we were relieved by the mid-watch. Now, meanwhile, below decks, the bricklayer was asleep. He was our green hand, but he was not doing well. The roar of the wind through the rigging came to the ear muffled, like the distant rumble of a train crossing a trestle or the surf on a beach, while the loud crash of the seas on her weather bows seemed almost to rend the beams and planking asunder as it resounded through the forecastle. The creaking and groaning of the timbers, stanchions, and bulkheads, and the strain of the vessel was undergoing was felt, served to drown the groans of the dying man. as he tossed uneasily in his bunk. At 2 bells in the middle of the watch, that is in land parlance, 1 o'clock in the morning, the order was roared out on the forecastle, "All hands on deck and shorten sail!" Then the sleepy sailors tumbled out of their bunk and into their clothes, oilskins and sea boots, and up on deck. 'Tis when that order comes on cold, blustering nights that Jack grimly mutters, "Who would not sell a farm and go to sea?" It was on deck that the force of the wind could be fully appreciated, especially after leaving the stifling forecastle. It seemed to stand up against you like a wall, making it almost impossible to move on the heaving decks or to breathe as the fierce gusts came dashing by. The schooner was hove to under jib, foresail, and mainsail. We proceeded to lower the foresail and make it fast. The night was dark, greatly impeding our labor. Finally, the wind began to drop. By 10 o'clock, we were talking of heaving her to. We passed a ship, 2 schooners, and 4-masted barkentine under the smallest canvas, and at 11 o'clock, running up the spanker and jib, we hove to. Below, a couple of men was sewing the bricklayer's body in canvas. And so, with the storm, passed away the bricklayer's soul. Not bad for a green hand, huh? Thank you. Thank you. Now, I decided I couldn't keep working hard to get ahead. I had to work a little more smart than that, yeah? So I would take up a trade, yeah? I began to see that that noble working man wasn't so noble, didn't end up very noble or dignified after he was worn out. So I thought electricity was just coming in. So I went into the Oakland Municipal Railway, right into the superintendent's office, and I burst in and I said, "I want to be an electrician. I'm willing to work hard and start at the bottom." And he just eyed me up and down. "Well, strapping young lad like you, yeah, we can use a man like you. You'll go far willing to work hard, start at the bottom." No. I said, "Great, when do I start?" "Well, now, before you can be an electrician, you got to be an electrician's helper." "Great, when do I start?" "Before you can be an electrician's helper, you got to be an oiler in the machine shop." "Great, the better I know the machines, the better an electrician I'll make. When do I start?" "No, before you can be an oiler, you got to be an oiler's assistant." I started to see the pattern, but I hadn't been indoctrinated, right? Work hard and get ahead. I thought in a year I'll marry that superintendent's daughter and run the place. When do I start? Now, before you could be an oiler's assistant, you got to shovel coal in the power plant. If I was going to start any farther at the bottom, he'd have to send me down in the mines to get the coal. But still, I said, "Great, when do I start?" 7 o'clock next morning. So, in I went. Work. I, who thought I knew what work was, found out I didn't know the first thing about work. And I began shoveling that coal, trundling it in the wheelbarrow onto the scale, trundling it into the fire room, dumping it for the firemen, shoveling that coal. Now, I was learning to be an electrician. How much do you suppose I was paid an hour? You're starting to see the pattern. 10 cents an hour. And I worked 7 days a week, including Sundays, with 1 day off a month. He'd said 10 hours. There was no overtime. I was working 12 hours just trying to keep up. Now that first day, I devoured my entire lunch before noon, and all I could think was, I could work through the noon hour. Work hard. Now, 4 o'clock, the day shift left, the firemen left, And then came the night shift. And I had to go on shoveling for the night shift. Work hard till you get ahead. 5 o'clock, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 8:30, that first day. And I limped my way, washed off some of the grime I was covered in, and went on to the electric tram, which they gave me a ticket for, provided nobody needed the seat. And I sat, but sure enough, next stop, a woman got up and there was no seat for her. And when I went to rise, I found to my amazement I could not. In the cold, stiff breeze, my complaining joints and frozen muscles had taken the shape of the seat. And it took me the whole way to my stop, just to trundle to the door and get ready to get off. And then I fell to the ground when I got off and staggered my way home, limped into my kitchen, collapsed at the table. My mother threw a beefsteak on, and I began devouring bread and butter. But before the steak was cooked, I was asleep at the table. She and my father had to sleepwalk me to bed, peel off my boots. Now, the next morning, she gave me a double breakfast, and I went with a hunger lunch. And there, now the second day, was the worst. Oh, my wrists were swelled and sprained. Now, any of you ever have a sprained ankle or have to walk on that? Well, imagine trying to shovel coal with 2 sprained wrists, yeah? And on I went, shoveling the coal. On it went like this, day after day, week after week, month after month, looking forward to that one day off when all I wanted to do was what? Read? Go out with a girl? No, sleep. I was a perfect work beast. Now, this went on until one of the firemen who had been eyeing me kind of strange, he snuck up to me and he said, boy, I would have told you earlier, but I thought sure you'd break under the strain. But you're killing yourself, and only to lower the price of labor. What are you talking about? He fired 2 full-grown men who were getting $40 a month and hired you at $30 a month to do both their jobs. I thought he was making an electrician out of me. He was making $50 a month out of me. And all I could think, I'll show that superintendent I could outwork any 2 men. And on I went. Oh, I was as willing a wage slave as ever capitalist exploited. On I went, killing myself. The firemen had to wrap my wrists in leather bands to keep them from swelling and take the stresses and strains thitherto borne by my wrists. And this went on until that fireman brought me a newspaper clipping. An all too common story in those days. This was the 1890s. You've heard maybe of the gay 90s? Well, we call them the terrible 90s. This cycle of depression and men getting unemployed, it's just built into the system, and we were going through it back then. And so, this story was about a working man who had had a job 20 years, was fired without warning, without cause. Couldn't find another. Couldn't outcompete that young and hungry for that lousy 10 cents an hour. Watching his wife grow lean and gaunt, his children's bellies distending with hunger. He took his own life. This was one of the men I had replaced. Where did hard work get him? Huh? He got thrown out on the scrap heap like a worn-out machine. And I said, to hell with hard work. This work orgy had sickened me on work. I never wanted to do another day's hard work in the rest of my life. So I left. I quit. I said, rather be a hobo, a tramp, a bum, riding the rails and begging for my food than living and dying in the sweatshops. And I wasn't alone. There were hundreds of thousands of men riding the rails towards Washington, D.C. They called us Coxey's Industrial Army of the Unemployed. And we were trying to convince Washington to invest in roads and so men could get work and bridges and to have public works and to have an 8-hour workday and to have 5-day work week and medical care for the million men a year mangled in the machines. These were the things men were fighting for, being beaten for, fired for, things we take for granted. Just 100 years ago, and still in the world somewhere today. That's when I talked to my fellow working men and learned what I was. I was a socialist. I read the books, and it made sense. Now, I remember on the road, I got the vision of the social pit, like it was a concrete thing, like I was holding myself by main strength and sweat above the muck and mire and the discarded workers at the bottom. But I confess, a terror struck me. What when my muscles give out? What when I could no longer outcompete those young and hungry for that lousy 10 cents an hour? Down I'll go. And so I determined never to be a muscle merchant again, never to sell my brawn, but instead my brain. Criminality, that was out. I had seen where that led as a pirate. And so I would train my brain. And when I was 50, instead of getting thrown out and discarded, well, I'd be commanding the highest prices for my wares. And I determined never to work another day's hard work more than absolutely necessary to get out of hard work. Does that make sense? I began to understand that you work hard for somebody else, and they get rich, and you get worn out. You work hard for your fellow worker, for a cause, or for your own self. Then you can get ahead. You understand? The difference, this was the education I was getting on the road, back behind the scenery of society, where I could see the wheels and cogs working. Like in the Constitutional Court, where I was dragged for committing the crime of looking at Niagara Falls. They called it vagrancy, because I had no job, right? So they hauled me in, and there I learned about our constitutional justice system. And now I had been reading the books, and I thought I knew my rights. They had a row of us, and they just went down a few seconds each. Vagrancy, how do you plead? 30 days. Vagrancy, how do you plead? 30 days before anybody could say anything. When it came to me, vagrancy, how do you plead? Your Honor, 30 days. But Your Honor, sit down, I'll give you 60. Huh? Yeah. And this one poor slob, he says, Your Honor, I lost my job. I got kids to feed. I came out here just looking for work. Sit down. 30 days. And then, thinking perhaps he'd sounded too harsh as we all marched out, he said to that poor soul, why'd you quit your job? I didn't quit. That's a strange. No, I 30 more days for quitting your job. And then at 19, I was put in convict stripes, in the chain gang, the lockstep, put on the rock pile in the Erie County Penitentiary, upstate New York, under the watchful eyes of Winchester rifles. And some of my patriotism began leaking out the bottom of my soul. And I began learning to care more about men and women and children than about some national boundary. And so, after 30 days, surviving by my wiles and by befriending an old-timer who made me a whole man, and I tell you, in prison I saw things that are unspeakable, really, unthinkable to me. And, you know, men are killed in prisons. And by our paid thugs, just as they were in the first prison ever built by man. Yeah, today. And that's not the worst of it. It would, I but skim the surface. It would take a deep plummet to touch bottom at the Erie County Penitentiary. I worked my way back through Canada, telling stories the whole time to get my food, learning how to tell a tale. Went back at 19 and became a high school student, having to pay my way by being a janitor at my own high school. Now, the only break in this toil, in this endless toil that I was going through, was the great Klondike Goldstruck hit. It was like it finally came, all of our dreams. And my sister, Eliza, my stepsister, Eliza, she grub staked us to go up to the Klondike and if I would take her husband, Captain Shepard. But he wasn't healthy enough to make the trip and survive it, so he went back when we hit Chilkoot Pass. First, we bought the parkas and 2,000 pounds of equipment. And now I had to carry it 150-pound loads up the Chilkoot Pass with dead donkeys and despairing miners on either side. And by the end, I was out packing some of the Indian guys. Then we built our own boats. And we had to hammer it across Lake Linderman. And on the morning we finally got across, after 3 tries being blown back, the lake froze and we were last into the gold country that first year of the rush. So I spent a year there, but never found any gold. But I mined the stories of the old sourdoughs for a fortune when I got back. And one story was about a dog that I met up there. Anybody know his name? Buck Jack. I couldn't write a book about a hero named Jack, right? So I made it Buck. But yes, now I'll also let you know right out front that I stole some of the premise, some of the idea from another book called Northland Dogs. And he sued me and we settled. But his book wasn't really anything like what came out, because what came out was from inside the mind of the animal. That was considered experimental at the time. Yeah? And I didn't know if it would do well or not, so I sold the rights for $2,000. And this book, that had been published in 36 languages and never out of print, and $2,000 is all I got for it. But it was about that call that brings us to the wild, whatever that is, and that speaks to something inside and touches something ancient, primeval, primordial, primitive, atavistic inside us. And it happened to Buck the dog just as it happened to me and many men who go to the wild. Buck was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-breasted dog, white-fanged and long-furred. But behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half-wolves and wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him, and telling him the sounds made by the wildlife in the forest, and dreaming with him and beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of his dreams. Like to hear a little bit more of that one? As we're here in celebration of that one, right? So let's hear a little bit more. One night, he sprang from sleep with a start, eager-eyed, nostrils quivering and scenting, his mane bristling in recurrent waves. From the forest came the call, a long-drawn howl, like yet unlike any noise made by husky dog. And he knew it in the old familiar way as a sound heard before. He sprang through the sleeping camp and in swift silence dashed through the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he went more slowly, with caution in every movement, till he came to an open place among the trees, and looking out saw, erect on haunches, with nose pointed to the sky, a long, lean timber wolf. He made no noise, yet it ceased from its howling and tried to sense his presence. Buck stalked into the open, half crouching, body gathered compactly together, tail straight and stiff, feet falling with unwanted care. Every movement advertised commingled threatening and overture of friendliness. It was the menacing truce that marks the meeting of wild beasts that prey. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, how are we doing on time? Sure. So, before we move into the questions, let me give you a little sequel to Call of the Wild. White Fang. Have anybody read it? Yeah. So I say that because despite writing 20 novels and 400 shorter works and 200 works of nonfiction on every subject, from evolution to astral projection and farming, I'm known for my Northland Tales and for that connection to place. And the opening of White Fang gives you that strong sense of place and man's place. Dark spruce forest frowned on either side of the frozen waterway. The trees had been stripped by a recent wind of their white covering of frost and seemed to lean toward each other, black and ominous in the fading light. A vast silence reigned over the land. The land itself was a desolation, so lone and cold that the spirit of it was not even that of sadness. In fact, there was a hint in it of laughter, but of a laughter more terrible than any sadness. It was the laughter frozen as the frost and partaking in the grim infallibility of nature, and mirthless as the smile of the Sphinx. It was the wild, the frozen-hearted Northland wild, laughing at the futility of life and the effort of life. But there was life abroad in the land, and defiant. Along the frozen waterway toiled a string of wolfish dogs. Frost rimmed their furs, and spouts of vapor came out of their noses. Leather harness was on the dogs, and leather traces connected them to a sled that pulled behind. The sled was made of stout birch bark. It was runnerless, so its full surface rested on the snow. And the front was curled up, forcing down and under the bore of soft snow that rose before it like a wave. Before the dogs, on wide snowshoes, toiled a man. Behind the sled, on snowshoes, toiled a second man. On the sled, in a box, lay a third man. A man whom the wild had so harried and beaten down that he would never toil nor move again. It is not the way of the wild to like movement. Life is an affront to it, for life is movement, and the wild strives always to stop movement. It freezes the streams to keep them from rushing to the sea. It drives the sap out of the limbs of the trees till they're frozen to their bowl hearts. And most terribly of all does the wild harry man, who of life is the most restless, ever in revolt against the dictum that all movement must, in the end, come to the cessation of movement. But the two men who were still alive toiled on, dauntless and indomitable, puny adventurers bent on colossal adventure, pitting themselves against the might and force of a land as lone and cold and silent and pulseless as the abysses of space. The silence was palpable. It weighed on them like the weight of many atmospheres presses on the diver, squeezing them down into the inner recesses and crushing out like wine from the grape all undue human ardors and vanities until they perceive themselves small and weak, specks and motes, moving with little cunning and small wisdom amidst the great elements and forces. Thank you. Thank you very much.